How did it become okay for ordinary people to feel like they were a part of a system that they couldn't really participate in shaping? A high school student in Korea who might be told, you should go into science because you might find the cure for cancer, or you might want to think about writing the next great novel. Maybe some would love hearing that and be excited. But I think it's probably more common that they'll say, oh, that would never be me. And I find that deeply depressing. Who owns your identity? You do. So you should give yourself permission to pursue your passion. And somehow that is often lost. When I taught undergraduate classes, I asked this question: what are you going to do to make the world a better place? And that is shocking. What am I, this one single person, going to do to make the world a better place? And I even had students come to office hours saying, what do you want me to write? I said, that's exactly what I don't want you to ask. I want you to tell me what you are going to do to make the world a better place. It's a reminder to me as the professor that I have the luxury of having dozens of students every semester in class who will go off to do amazing things. I know it's going to happen, but I need you as a student to know that that could happen. If we could just inspire that kind of thinking in all of our classes, maybe the world would be a better place. My name is Ken Ono. I'm a mathematician, and I also work in the space called AI for Math. I'm a professor at the University of Virginia on leave, and I'm the founding mathematician at Axiom Math. The very first time I heard the term artificial intelligence was in 1993, and I met a faculty member who said, I work in artificial intelligence. My very first words were, oh, that's interesting. I specialize in natural intelligence. And I was cocky. I would have my butt handed to me many times for using words like that. But that's where I came from. Exactly 1 year ago, I was a happy-go-lucky university professor, writing my papers, enjoying life at the University of Virginia, and then there was a dramatic change. I came face to face with large language models at work, the Frontier Math program, where this company based in Berkeley called Epoch AI hired professional mathematicians from around the world to assemble very difficult math problems. And their goal was to assess the capabilities of large language models as they improve. For the first time, I struggled to assemble questions that 챗GPT would get wrong. I was devastated. At the time, I was one of the few scientists who had been given access to these state-of-the-art models, and I had to be patient for a few months to go by before the world did recognize that, yeah, these models know so much. These models know more facts than any human you would ever find. So for a few months, I was devastated. I was thinking, how am I going to stay ahead of AI? But I actually think that's the wrong question. If our goal is to always stay ahead of AI, then I think we're going to lose. Nobody would be interested in watching Usain Bolt race against a motorcycle in the 1 mile run. It's not a fair race, but we still watch the Olympics. We, as a society, now know how to accept that machines can outperform humans in every physical way, but we're still now coming to grips with the fact that the brain, deep inquiry, computers have caught up. The large language models should be thought of as the most extraordinary librarian the world has ever seen. If it has been written down, the large language model has probably seen it. If it's on YouTube, the large language model has probably been trained on it. If you read a newspaper article by the afternoon, the large language model has probably seen it. Good luck with competing with that ability to collect information. Information, knowledge is now cheap. But how you use it and how you verify it has become more expensive. Do you want your librarian to be your neurosurgeon? Do you want your librarian to be your air traffic controller, somehow keeping an eye on the hundreds of planes that are flying over North America or Korea? No way, because that human judgment is important. My identity has changed. My view on intelligence now has changed quite a bit. The ability to reason, make proper inferences, whether you can do it quickly or slowly, it doesn't matter. But can you create a new concept? Can you generate ideas? Can you string concepts together in a deep way? That is intelligence. That is not the regurgitation of facts. And we're not good at teaching that. Are you good at setting the dials to design a system from scratch that was going to produce some gadget, whether it's as an industry or a computer program, or perhaps a whole new area of science? That's deep intelligence. And it rarely is the form that is recognized in schools at any level. Do you have the ability to recognize patterns in areas of thought that can be transferred from one discipline to another so that you can propel another area forward? I would have said 5 years ago, oh, that's just being in the right spot at the right time. But that's unfair. Being in the right spot at the right time, well, you still have to make that observation. So there's an element of recognizing a target of opportunity. That is genius. And I don't use genius very lightly. The student, the worker who becomes an expert in their niche field because they plug away and learn something new about that field every day is so hard-nosed and is so committed that that is also intelligence and a kind of genius that we need to recognize. I have a very unique personal story. I'm a son of a mathematician. When I was a child, I was considered gifted in mathematics, and my parents decided at an early age that I was going to be a mathematician. My parents actually had a plan for all three of the boys. My oldest brother was going to be a pianist. He did it. I was the youngest, was going to be a mathematician. And the middle son, who they said wasn't good at math and wasn't gifted in music, well, he should just go work in a bank, just make a living, which inspired him to do great things. My brother Santa has gone on to become the president of the University of Michigan. He's a very distinguished scientist, and he was literally driven by this need to prove that his early assessment was incorrect. For me, it almost went in a very bad way. I dropped out of high school. The last thing I wanted to be in high school was anything my parents wanted me to be. I didn't want to be the one Asian kid in class that was expected to be good at math when all the other kids had lives. I couldn't play baseball, the all-American pastime. And I hated it. In April of 1984, I was of the mindset that I'm going to run away from home. I'm never going to see my parents again, and I don't care about that. I'm going to strike out on my own. In April 1984, a letter came to the house addressed to my father. It was on this yellowed piece of paper that looked like it might as well have been 100 years old. It was a letter written by Janaki Ammal, who was a widow of the Indian mathematician Ramanujan. And she thanked my father for making a small gift to help commission a statue in memory of Ramanujan. And me, seeing my dad cry, and he never cried. He was almost no emotions. This letter brought him to tears, and he brought this letter to me afterwards. I have to tell someone what this is about. So Ramanujan, it turned out, I learned that day, was a mystic, an autodidact. He had visions of mathematics that his goddess, he believed, gave him gifts of formulas that he would write down in his notebooks. Because of his passion for mathematics, he didn't study in any of his other courses, so he ended up flunking out of college twice. Here's my dad talking about someone who was a 2-time college dropout, but had left behind 3 notebooks filled with formulas that he was studying himself. And I only learned later, one of the reasons that my father was so in love with the story of Ramanujan is because Ramanujan had actually represented hope for him, his one chance in life as a Japanese mathematician post-World War II. My father wanted to be a mathematician, but he went to college at a time when the world was at war. He loved mathematics as a way of escaping from long lines waiting for food. In the aftermath of World War II, the United States sent some of their best mathematicians to Japan to rebuild the universities and train the mathematicians. My father first learned about Ramanujan at the conference where he was discovered by a Princeton professor who invited him to study with him at Princeton, launching his career. Ramanujan died at a very early age at 32. He was nearly forgotten, and the mathematicians of the world contributed small gifts to give Mrs. Ramanujan the statue that the government had promised her in 1920. That letter and a photograph that she shared with us of the statue, it represented him remembering what it was like for him to struggle and the moment where he got his chance. So what did Ramanujan mean to me that day? It gave me hope in the following. It was the first time I heard my parents say and look up to, like a hero, someone who hadn't gone to Harvard or Princeton and was a perfect student. On the contrary, it turned out my father's hero was a 2-time college dropout, and I needed that. Later at the University of Chicago, I was a horrible student, but right before my senior year, flipping through the channels on the television, I saw a video, public broadcasting service documentary about Ramanujan, who I hadn't thought about in years. And I was fascinated because here in color on TV was more than the vaguest of outlines about Ramanujan that my dad told me. There was the whole story. And it kind of jump-started me. I had a lot of catching up to do. There I became a good student. And it was then when the biography of Ramanujan came out called The Man Who Knew Infinity. Maybe it was a sign. Maybe I was meant to follow Ramanujan. And so I started to work on a thesis based on his work. And I'm so glad I made that choice because by the end of my PhD, what I worked on was called the theory of Galois representations, which was meant to study Ramanujan's backwater mathematics. But by 1993, the bombshell news in mathematics for the end of the 20th century was the proof of Fermat's last theorem. And the proof of Fermat's last theorem depend on these Galois representations. I don't know what it is. Following Ramanujan every time he appeared has been like the best decision I've ever made in my life. And every one of those could have gone a different way. So one important theme about Ramanujan for me is where would we be? And I don't mean just me as a mathematician, where would we all collectively be had he not been discovered? That is a world I cannot fathom. And because of that, you're left wondering, there must be other Ramanujans walking planet Earth. Maybe they don't come from privilege. How do we find them? And how do we nurture them when we find them? I was lucky enough for a number of years to run a program called The Spirit of Ramanujan, where we looked for undiscovered talent. And what's interesting about this, my boss, my former student, Karina Hong, studied with me in a research program. She was one of our first recipients. We discovered her. It makes me wonder where she would be today had she not received this Spirit of Ramanujan Fellowship. There are, I am sure, many, many undiscovered folks that we need to find. I think the idea, the ability and the potential to be someone like Ramanujan, or at least creative in a productive way, I think it resides in us all. You just have to give students of all ages the opportunity to A, be brave enough to act on their curiosity, and then offer them a system that embraces it. Some of your best students in Korea, the best students in the United States, the best students worldwide, they're stressed out in high school. They're probably even stressed out in middle school, worrying about how do I get into the right high school? How do I get into the right college? Will I get the right test scores? If you're motivated to participate in those just because they are checkboxes, that's messed up. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't do that because I don't want to be ignorant and say don't participate in the system that will ultimately decide your fate with regard to college, but pause and recognize you're participating in that system. Education starts with inspiring people to want to know more about the world in which they live, wanting to know more about the cultures of the world because we share the world together, and appreciate what is different in other parts of the world and in other cultures, because that's why I went to college, right? I wanted to learn about those things. That's why I travel the world. If you have children that are infants, how wonderful is it to play with them, say with like a stack of boxes or building blocks. Play for children is science. They're not really learning about gravity, but they're really learning about gravity. They may pile blocks on top of the other and knock them over and giggle, and they'll do it again. Think about how wonderful the world is when you get to learn about it without worrying about what your future and what your reputation will be. I want, when my students are in my class, to say, this is a wonderful class, Professor Ono, because the subject is beautiful. And I do my very best to try to get that across. But I'm not a fool. I know that I'm participating in a system where at the end of the day, the students are worried, am I going to get an A or not? And how will that impact my ability to go to graduate school in math or medical school or law school, because that GPA is so important. And I hate that. I utterly hate that. Why? It's an opportunity lost. What I like about AI, and this is actually how I transitioned from being devastated by AI has already read my papers. It understands my papers better than I remember them. Think about all the subjects in adjacent areas of mathematics that I could just ask AI about, and the AI is not going to laugh at me. And it, as a great librarian, will dutifully answer any question I would ask. The access to knowledge, if you are privileged enough to have access to the internet, and you are privileged enough to be able to afford access to a large language model, knowledge quickly became cheap. In the United States, it could cost $80,000 to spend 1 year attending a university. And here's the dirty secret. I could learn everything that you would learn book-wise, academically, from a large language model at my own pace, probably accelerated with a large language model. What I would not get would be the human access, how the right questions were derived, what the next questions in the field might be. That's why we still go to college, and that's why we still need professors. But all of the other stuff, the tutoring, the precision learning, that AI can help with. I actually believe that we in this world aren't doing the best we can at educating our children. And I don't say that to be critical of educators. I am an educator. But it's always a treat to visit a kindergarten class, a first grade class, when it's bring your parent to school day so they can talk about what they do. Oh, I know all the prime numbers, or I'm really good at adding. That wonder, and I want to just bottle up this energy, because if we could maintain that wonder in the world and the energy that children have when everything around them is new, think about where we would be today. So go find your passion. The best scientists in the world need to still view the world as a wondrous thing. The best doctors in the world still need to recognize that what they practice is supposed to come from a place of benevolence, not I have this practice, but I'm a university professor that happens to be, has a clinical practice, and I'm going to write articles about my patients. I think that's messed up. If we pay so much attention on and value so much perfection and speed in ordinary test taking, then how are we training someone to be the next Einstein or the next you name famous professor was just wondering out loud in their lab, I wonder if such and such is true. For my children, I want them to be passionate about the world that they live in. And if you're passionate about the world that you live in, then you're deeply worried about the climate. You're deeply worried about the conflict that exists between different cultures, which there's wars all over the place. How can that happen? Who are the people that you really look up to the most? Maybe they are the oddballs. In my country, in the United States, where education is so expensive, you could come out of college with $150,000 in debt. And then you may go on to a professional school, accruing another $200,000 in debt. And then 3 years later, discovering, I can't stand the sight of blood, but now I can't leave my profession because I have all of these loans. That is purgatory. you then are stuck. And that's when your life is, well, I go to work because it pays the bills. Who owns your identity? You do.